Hey, 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 welcome to the Green Nurse Podcast, where we bring hope and inspiration for growth and healing. We're here to change the dialogue and stigma around what it means to feel good and be high. Hence the H for hope, I for inspiration, G for growth, and H for healing. There are a lot of people who are making amazing cannabis formulations for patients, and there are a lot of companies who are selling these amazing products, yet no one is truly educating medical patients on how to use cannabinoids as medicine. That's what we do. We educate and empower and teach on safe consumption. Here is a little video about what we do in the cannabis space as nurses. And I'm going to pull up this handy dandy little video that's one of my favorites. And let's get started.
Change the paradigm of healthcare.
The Green Nurse is a holistic cannabis nurse that teaches on the endocannabinoid system and the safe utilization of cannabis and other progressive tools to help people reach a better quality of life.
I'm the founder of Holistic Caring. We're based here in California, and we do educational programs and case management for patients on how to use cannabis therapeutically as a medicine.
We're also here to decrease stigma around what it means to feel good and be high, hence the H for hope, I for inspiration, G for growth, and H for healing.
As the founder of Holistic Caring, I basically oversee the whole ship, and what we're doing is progressive education.
Cannabis actually supports all 11 organ systems, our immune system, and all the neurotransmitter signaling systems that give messages to tell our body to either do something or not do something. Because the plant was prohibited, it prevented health professionals, doctors and nurses from learning about cannabis as medicine.
I want to change the paradigm of healthcare and us paving the way into a new vanguard of medicine. And I'm excited to really bring this into light. There's a company called Canam that we're merging with, and we will now be doing global education.
It's about education, it's about empowerment, it's about teaching people how to feel good, bridging the gap from what they're not getting from traditional medicine, utilizing different plant medicines, adaptogens, tips, tricks, hugs, and nugs of information to support and nourish the most important system in our body.
And it's a lot of soul work, a lot of love, a lot of discipline, and meditation. I'm using my life work as a testimony to others to learn how they can be their own hero and then go help heal the world.
And we are, as nurses, the game changers.
All right, that's probably one of my favorite videos. Growing in health, growing in cannabis. So we've been highlighting cannabis professionals as we're truly in revolutionary times where we're changing how we approach and take care of patients. And you've heard us talk about safe consumption. And tonight we're going to be speaking with Attorney Matthew Pappas, who is a civil rights attorney in the cannabis space. Matthew is also an attorney for churches that utilize cannabis as the holy sacrament. Matthew serves multiple states, including Arizona, California, Michigan, Florida, and many others. He provides legal representation for medical marijuana industry, site acquisition, business organization, permit acquisition, business development, and raid representation, civil and criminal, state and federal court. Some of his clients have been the Native American Church, the Greater Orange County Cannabis Association, and Sky High Holistics. Welcome, Matthew.
Hi, Sherri. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited to dive into this a little bit because I'll tell you the reason why. My whole high thing, right? We want to decrease stigma around what it means to feel good and be high. So cannabis, for a lot of people, the first thing it brings them is that hope, the hope that things can be different, right? And then inspiration. They become inspired. And when they're inspired, they're in spirit. And wisdom of plant medicine can truly reach people in ways that they've never thought before. So hope, inspiration, growth. Growth is an action word. We're growing to the sun. We're growing towards the light. We're growing in health. And healing isn't the absence of illness or disease. It's doing the best we can with what we have right here, right now. And truly, as a cannabis nurse and also a medical cannabis patient, spirituality was something that was missing in my life when I was sick, suffering, and in the space on being over multiple pharmaceuticals. And so as I've evolved in the space and have healed using plant medicine and other plant entheogens, spirituality really kind of opened up the door for me to bring this more into the conventional system. Because if you think about it, Matthew, in the conventional system, what are we focusing on? What do doctors and nurses focus on? Diagnoses, body parts, pharmaceuticals, side effects, cutting people open, cutting parts out, surgeries. If we're lucky, we get to mental, emotional health, and usually not until someone's in a crisis. And rarely do we ever touch upon spirituality unless someone is dying. So here in the cannabis space as nurses, we're kind of trying to flip that switch and really look at spirituality as the root of cannabis care. And so this is where I'm really excited to speak with you this evening to talk a little bit about using cannabis as the holy sacrament in the church. So what I'm going to do is pull up this awesome quote of yours, and let's dig into this. What prompted you? This is because this quote spoke to me loud and clear. Not only as like I said, as a patient, but as a nurse that has been taking care of patients since 2016 using plant medicine, cannabis and other plant entheogens. So I'm going to zip the lip and let you take the stage, and let's talk about this quote.
Well, I've been fighting on behalf of patients prior to representing church members for many years. And it is, and it's always been important to me to look at what is effective for a person in terms of healing. And healing is something that goes beyond just what Western medicine, what you've kind of iterated there as the Western medicine beliefs in prescribing prescription medications and things of that nature. It goes beyond that. There's a spirituality to it. There's a mental state to it. And the fight that I've been in as an attorney kind of transitioned over a period of time from helping the patients, the seriously disabled individuals who should not be discriminated against because cannabis is an effective medication for them, because plant medication is effective for them. They should not be discriminated, to learning more and more about the spiritual affect, as you've talked about, the entheogenic qualities of cannabis as well. And so my journey and this quote reflect the direction that I've gone. I think it incorporates the idea of not isolating people and discerning because they have a medicine that is effective for them on the secular side, but then spiritually they also have the right to practice their religion. And if those religious beliefs include the belief that cannabis is holy sacrament, they have every right in this country, especially in this country, to practice and hold those religious beliefs.
Yeah. It's the whole discrimination piece of it really strikes home for me, because literally the illness that a lot of nurses that we've been working with, who are now cannabis nurses, who have overcome chronic debilitating illnesses, some of them have been on disability, some of them have been on workers' comp, and also too working in a system that tests for cannabis. So basically I could be on 18 pharmaceuticals and show up to work. and as long as I had a prescription, it didn't matter. I could still show up to work. But using cannabis as medicine, replacing all those pharmaceuticals, the stigma and the misinformation that people have that I've replaced all those pharmaceuticals with plant medicine means that I'm high all the time. Right? So that's the whole thing. So it's just a perception issue. It's the cognitive dissonance issue. It's the stigma issue. It's the lack of education issue. And it's in that discrimination, I just want to say thank you for doing that, because, I was offered during COVID to go back to work. I was a pediatric nurse, going back to Children's Hospital, and they had a pretty penny to offer me to do this. However, I asked them point blank, I use cannabis as medicine. Would you still allow me to come back? And their answer was no. You have to have a clean test. So that to me was just really, wow, we are still in archaic times.
We really are. I had a client for many, many years, Marla James, who was a very strong cannabis activist. Her husband, David, was a leader in Normal in Orange County, and Marla, a leader as well in moving forward the idea that cannabis is effective as medication. Marla had been on prescription opioids for a number of years, and it got to a point, because you build up a reliance on this, to where her doctor was telling you can't keep doing this, it's going to kill you. She went to another doctor, a more holistic medicinal provider, who suggested cannabis as medicine, and she began using the cannabis, and it was effective. She stopped using the opioids. Marla, along with 3 other patients, in around 2010, I represented, we sued the cities of Costa Mesa and Lake Forest for this discriminatory conduct in closing down dispensaries that were providing the medication necessary for these folks to live on a level playing field. What it all comes down to in this secular society is money. It comes down to money. And the problem is that I remember arguing the case at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and a judge, one of the justices up on the dais, saying to me, well, would you give up your argument if, you left this particular, there were several technical arguments that I'd made. And he reminded me, said, Mr. Pappas, this section of the Americans with Disabilities Act that you're arguing, it doesn't just apply to Title II, which is what applies to the cities. It also applies to all the employers out there that folks work to. And this goes to what you're talking about, you going back to work at Children's Hospital and saying, well, I use cannabis. Under laws that protect people who are using opiates, and it's funny that you talk about high and being high. They're using much stronger drugs, much more dangerous drugs, things that are harmful. Cannabis is a plant. And in fact, the judge comes back and says, well, it's going to force an accommodation to be made by those employers. And that was the key. Because the case would cause that economically, it would have that dollar impact. The court came back and eventually ruled against me in that particular case. I of course, believe the court was wrong. We had a great dissenting opinion from one of the justices on the court. But the idea that this discrimination can continue based on folks using something to mitigate their physical or mental disabilities in a way that levels the playing field for them so that they can operate normally. Marla James, she would use cannabis and she was fine. She was better. My daughter, Victoria, who is now dead, would use cannabis and it would make her more effective. Didn't make her, it allowed her to participate in life effectively. And so I think there's just a big problem in this country where everything seems to focus on money. And at some point we need to realize that's not what everything is about. It's not all about capitalism, and it's not all about money.
Yeah. So the interesting thing too is, when you just mentioned that about, functioning on pharmaceuticals versus functioning on a plant, and how, the Marla felt normal using the plant, right? So if you think about when you're on this is interesting. I just have to talk about it because I'm sciencey. If you're on 5 or more pharmaceuticals, there's a 50% chance that the drugs are interacting. If you're on 10 or more pharmaceuticals, 100% chance that your pharmaceuticals are interacting, and probably not in the best way. At one point in time, I was on 18 pharmaceuticals. There is no way I could show up and work. I couldn't even take care of my kids. I couldn't take care of myself. Cannabis comes into my life. One plant replaces all of the pharmaceuticals that I needed to take ongoing. Does it mean that I don't need pharmaceuticals at all? No. Of course, sometimes you do with circumstances, but the ongoing ones that I was plagued with that had all of the side effects, I was able to come off. And that is really, really critical when we are working with people. People that are sick and suffering and in pain don't want to feel worse. We just don't. You know, we will do whatever it takes to live another day comfortably.
And I think that's really key to it. We had a case. I had a case involving a Marine who had come back from overseas. He'd been involved in Afghanistan and in Iraq and other places fighting for the United States. And the Department of Defense had determined he was suffering from PTSD. And so they sent him back to the U.S. to a base in Oklahoma. And by the time he came back, he was on 13 different pharmaceuticals, Sherri, 13 different pharmaceuticals. And what you're saying, I think, is 100% right. There's a 100% chance that there's some interaction going on between these things. But basically, his wife had told me when I took on the case later that he just was a zombie, wasn't functioning correctly at all. So he began using cannabis. He began using that in the stead of these 13 pharmaceuticals, still using a couple of them because, yes, you're right. Sometimes you're going to need to have a pharmaceutical. It's not, I don't think it's a one size fits all for anything in life. And it depends on each of us. But he then decided, he was in Oklahoma at the time. It was completely illegal. And he grew several cannabis plants. Police came in, raided his house, put in the newspaper. It was the biggest manufacturing of drug ring they'd found in several years in a small city in Oklahoma. And it was a big case in the news. And really, at that time frame, just destroyed his family life, what he was doing. His entire system, his entire life was put up on display and at risk. And all because cannabis was the most effective medication for him. It was treating his conditions far better than those 13 pharmaceuticals. Anyway, went to California, didn't have the proper permission from the court, thought he did, and was attacked in front of his children by U.S. Marshals while he was taking them to school. Just the whole idea that we would behave in this way as a society. And when I'm talking about society, in my quote, and going back to that, the distinction and quality of a society is determined by how we treat those people who are disabled and down on their luck and that need help from others. And sending in the police to attack a guy who's growing 6 cannabis plants for his own personal use, one of which was dying at the time, putting that in the press. They wanted to put him in jail for life. That was the request of the prosecuting attorney in Comanche County, Oklahoma. Well, it ended up that after it took 2 or 3 years, but we were able to work it out. So those charges were dismissed. Most of the charges were dismissed. He got out, was able to go to California, and no jail time, nothing to damage his family. But the idea that you would punish somebody for using a plant, a God-given plant given to us by our higher power, that is for everybody. Put that person in jail for life because of that is insanity. And it certainly is not something that you have or want to have in a civilized and advanced society.
Yeah. So I'm going to just share one quick little story because I think you'll appreciate this. And it has to do with the police. So someone was trying to break into my house last fall. This is a good story. It was a woman. She was clearly impaired. I think, she was definitely on some substances. Don't know what she was on, but she started pounding on my window, thinking that I had her baby, and if I didn't open the door, she was going to kill me. She started to vandalize my car. She broke into it, literally. So basically, I had to call the police right away, obviously. But while I'm standing there calling the police, she was baiting me to come out. And I, have a history of PTSD, like a lot of people. I've been assaulted before. And so, I got scared. So the fight or flight kicks in. And because I have been working with PTSD and I've been working with therapy and doing trauma recovery, I knew that cannabis right away would 100% take me off the ledge. Take me off the ledge of going out there and possibly hurting her, right? So fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Sometimes what happens is I fight, and I don't want to fight. I don't want to hurt people. So this is really, really real. So I literally brought out my bong. I knew with a couple of inhalations, I would be able to settle out and process the entire situation from a different perspective. So I have the phone there dialing 911. I brought out my bong and I started to do a couple of, big giant inhalations just to settle out as she's still pounding on my door. What ended up happening 5 minutes later as the police came, there was a couple of them, they were taking care of her. A policeman came to the door and I got scared. Now it's legal in Massachusetts for medical and it's legal for adult use, but I was still scared because my house was filled with smoke. So what I did was I got my medical card, and literally when I answered the door, I had the medical card right there. And I go, "Officer, I have a medical card. This is," I was like, literally. And he laughed and smiled and he goes, "It's okay." And I said, "The reason why I'm doing this is because, I've had incidences before. I got in trouble at BC for smoking behind the bushes. But the other thing too, is I said to him, if I had called you 10 years ago and I had been smoking, you would have arrested me too. Not only would you have arrested the lady for coming into my home, but you would have taken me off in handcuffs because I was using cannabis as medicine in my home." So it was a very, very interesting teaching moment, fully cognizant, knowing that I legally, I had the right to do it. I was in my home, but still I had the fear. I had fear. Like when I'm like, oh my God, I got cannabis all over my house. Oh my God, my tinctures, my gummies, my flower, my bong. Oh my God, I got to let him in. But you see,
it's sad that that you would have that fear, and I think a lot of people, I say we as a society, fear the police in those types of situations. I think the police are important. I think they play an important role in what goes on in society. I think we're human, so people are going to make mistakes. Sometimes it'll be the police officer, sometimes it will be individuals that are doing things that the police need to take care of and help enforce the laws in terms of. But to have that fear and to have it over cannabis and cannabis use is something that never should have happened. Never should have happened at all. There was a point at which I was fighting with the federal government back in 2013, 2014. The federal government had come in to help some California cities that were very discriminatory towards cannabis patients. And one of the things that has gone on in this country is since 1970, 1971, since the passage of the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act, the law that created the Federal Controlled Substances Act and placed cannabis in this prohibitory status under Schedule 1 of Title 2 of that law, the CSA, the Controlled Substances Act, is there hasn't been the research and work to look at the benefits of cannabis. One of the things I told the U.S. attorney in the forfeiture cases is I'm going to do a press release here at this point, and his name was Steve Welk, and let people know that over these decades that the federal government has been out to stop the testing and use of cannabis as a healing plant, as something to treat and medically help people. Since that has been going on, there have been numbers of people who would be alive today if that research had been allowed. And it's at the sole fault of the federal government for engaging and getting into an area it never should have in restricting cannabis that's caused this. And I think that war on drugs has led to the ultimate downfall of the war itself now. I think people have realized there was, or a majority of people have realized, there's a great deal of overkill in the war on drugs, and it simply was not effective. That the prohibitions and the mass incarceration is not the way to go in terms of drugs. There's this big fentanyl thing going on right now. And I think we need to be careful in how we assess dealing with these issues. We shouldn't be throwing people in jail that are, for instance, you were using cannabis, and you're right, 10 years before, if the police had come, and there would be a good chance that they'd discredit you and maybe cite you or take you to jail even back at that time. So I think we've got to be real careful in making sure the laws that we put on the books are not going to be harmful, like this federal law has been for so many years. That law is still in effect, Sherri. It's still in effect today.
I know.
So.
And actually, that was one of my questions that I had for you as well. Let's discuss really quickly before we get into church, the difference between what it means to be decriminalized versus fully legalized and free. I think there's a lot of people that don't understand that. And I think this would be a great time to talk about that.
Well, when California passed the Compassionate Use Act in 1996, when California voters did that, the law was written, and it was a proposition passed. Proposition 215 was written in a way where California's state law decriminalized cannabis penalties for patients using cannabis, possessing it, or growing it personally for their use at that time, up until the Medical Marijuana Program Act, which was passed by the legislature in 2003 and 2004 in California. Up until that time, it decriminalized it under state law. And what decriminalization is, it says we're not going to use state resources to penalize somebody. It's an affirmative defense to a crime on the books, which would be the possession of cannabis under California's Health and Safety Code at the time. So decriminalizing simply means that you're taking away the state criminal penalties. And the reason California can do that is because under our system of government in the United States, the federal government, while it's limited in power, is what it does have control over is supreme. It has, there's a clause called the Supremacy Clause. So California's legislature and the people of California could not vote to override the Federal Controlled Substances Act, but they could vote to decriminalize under California law. And the reason they could only vote to decriminalize is because if they voted to legalize marijuana in California, that likely would be considered in conflict with federal law because federal law is supreme. But by decriminalizing, they avoided that conflict. And the California state government was very careful. There was a period of time when people would refer to cannabis in California as the wild, wild west, and people were selling them, and there weren't very many regulations. And the reason for that is the state was afraid to regulate for fear that if they went too far, the laws all could be stricken or deemed to be in conflict with federal law. In fact, by decriminalizing, the smart way that the state did it, it was never in conflict. Now, the federal government could come in at any time and arrest people under the Controlled Substances Act, but the federal government doesn't have police officers on the ground doing that. So you don't see federal officers running around in police cars in your cities trying to find people that have drugs. That's not really the scope of their job, and they don't have the resources to do that. And so that was the principle, and that's what happened. Later, what has happened is Colorado, being the first state, its voters voted to go ahead and really legalize cannabis. And so while there could probably be an argument made that there is a conflict with federal law in that legalization, Congress did take steps there were steps taken by several former members of Congress. One was a Dana Rohrabacher from Huntington Beach, California, a Republican at the time. He's since been replaced. I think, and his replacement has been replaced. Somebody else voted in for that person as well. But at the time, passed in a bipartisan way legislation that really allowed these state laws to continue operating. So those have effectively protected the state laws that are there now, especially the medical laws. So you have some protection. I did make an argument, and I will say this: the Federal District of Columbia. So when we think about cannabis is still illegal throughout the United States, even today in 2022, your Congress, for all of you who are listening to this podcast or watching it, has still not gotten to the point of even allowing medical cannabis. The plant that we know is the most effective treatment for children with Dravet's syndrome. Still, the federal government has not done what it needs to do to take that off of Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act. And what's really quite disturbing about that is they've known for a long time, and they still don't have that done. We need to work at this point to get Congress, and it's been kind of on the verge. I think the House recently passed something of getting it done, but it really needs to be done at the federal level now, because still today it's legal. And in Washington, D.C., that's probably the only place, because it's the federal district that's constitutionally created as an area held and controlled by Congress and the federal government. But the voters of Washington, D.C. approved medical cannabis, the Legalization of Marijuana for Medical Use Act in 1998. And Congress, through several congressional folks in the House of Representatives, put a kibosh, because Congress controls the District of Columbia. It has plenary power over that district. Put a kibosh on that Initiative 59 moving forward. I think 70% of the people in the District of Columbia voted in 1998 to legalize marijuana for medical use. And it took until 2009 when finally this Barr amendment that prohibited was taken off by Congress. And effectively, Congress, through its Home Rule Act powers, allowed the citizens of Washington, D.C. to implement Initiative 59 that they voted on in 1998. The Democrats had taken back control of Congress, and so these measures, the Barr Amendment that was put in place by Bob Barr to prohibit cannabis, was taken out of play. And so things have moved forward in the district. And Congress, basically, through its Home Rule Act powers and its plenary authority over the district, approved the district's ability to use and have medical cannabis. And it's got it now. That's probably the only place in the country that you can say effectively has legalization of cannabis, because everywhere else the supremacy clause still applies. And I think it's a sad state of affairs when Congress doesn't take the time to act for the benefit of citizens who have and suffer from disabilities and conditions that are effectively treated by cannabis. That was a little bit long-winded, but
no, that was good. First of all, because there's a lot of new viewers, people that are tuning in for the first time, and a lot of it can be very confusing because, like you said, a lot of the messages have been based on propaganda and really, building up the stigma against cannabis. So this was just really good, so they could hear it from an attorney. So thank you for that answer. It was not long-winded at all, and I appreciate it for sure. Now we're going to get into something really exciting, probably one of my favorite topics. Because cannabis, for me, spirituality is the root of cannabis care. And, that H for hope, I for inspiration, G for growth, and H for healing. I presented at the American Cannabis Nurses Association in 2020. And the presentation was spirituality is the root of cannabis care. And we brought in nursing theory, Gene Watson's theory. So I want to discuss with you a little bit, a couple of things. What is a plant-based entheogen, and what is the history of religious use of cannabis? Let's start in there.
Well, an entheogen is a substance that allows the person that takes the entheogen, the plant-based entheogen, to reach a higher state and to be closer to their higher power. And as far as I know, and from the studies that I've done, cannabis is the oldest plant-based entheogen that we have historical data on that goes back 5,000 years. Goes back 5,000 years to Red China and to Shenong, who was a prophet of that time, and the perfected immortals on the stories of Lady Magoo and seances where cannabis was used to elevate as an entheogen these people so that they had a closer connection with their higher power. Well, it starts back thousands of years ago, and you can trace it back into China. And it is, then we can go to Japan and find that the Shinto religion has used cannabis for years and years and years, hundreds, thousands of years. The Shinto religion has used it. It's used in their funeral rites. It is used in temple. The clothes of the emperor made of hemp and considered, it's considered a cleaning agent in terms of the smoke, and in terms of usage, it's a cleansing agent for the mind. We can go to the Hindu religion and the Festival of Holi, the Festival of Colors. It's every year, and the bhang, B-H-A-N-G, the bhang that is used in that ceremony. And I remember I was meeting with some folks several years ago that had come over from India, and they had to correct I've been calling it bang, and it's actually produced bong. And so that's been used. And many stories related to that. You have the stories in the Buddhist book, the Tantra Mahakala, where there are references to cannabis and its use as an entheogen. We go to Islam, and while the Sunni and Shiite sects of that religion appear to be against cannabis use, there is a very old mystical sect called the Sufi sect that has for years and years used hashish, cannabis, as an entheogen. We can go back to Judaism. We had, for our cases, for my cases, and I've worked with numbers of lawyers, so when I'm saying we, I'm referring to this group of lawyers that I've worked with. But in some of the church cases in the past, we have brought in an expert witness. We'd hired an expert witness who has worked as a medical doctor, is Israeli, is a rabbi, a moil, did circumcisions, and his testimony goes back to prior to the formalization of Judaism and the time of the sons of Noah, when cannabis was used regularly in the life of people of the Jewish faith. And as time progressed, there is in Exodus in the Bible, also the Torah, the Old Testament of the Bible, still in use by Judaism, the ingredient list of the holy anointing oil. And included in that, there is something many believe was mistranslated by the Greeks into the Bible. Cannabis is included as an ingredient in the holy anointing oil. And so it has been used for thousands of years in Judaism and Christianity. And there are people that disagree with that assessment. I do have a copy of a Torah. I don't have it with me right here. That comes from Israel. It's in Hebrew, so you have to go from the back of, when you look up that Isaiah chapter, you see the reference to the calamus, which is supposedly was what was mistranslated, and it talks about the mistranslation in this version of the Torah. It has a translation into English, and it has a picture of the cannabis plant, and the idea that this was actually cannabis that was a component of the anointing oil. So you have it in Judaism, Christianity. You can go to the American native religions, the Huichol tribe in northern Mexico, the hemp gatherers of the Ohio Valley. And not all tribes, not all Native American tribes used cannabis. There's a variety of plant-based entheogens, peyote, ayahuasca, San Pedro, that are used by the Native American religions. But in terms of, and African religions have used cannabis, it's been used worldwide, and it's been used for over 5,000 years as an entheogen, not just as an entheogen, but also as a healing sacrament. And so you've got both components of it. You've got the component that is, and I like to call it spiritual healing. It's all healing, but it's spiritually healing to be able to get closer to your higher power with the cannabis sacrament. And so that is the idea of what an entheogen is, what a plant-based entheogen is, and cannabis being probably the oldest that we know of on a recorded basis. You know, other things that have been used as plant-based entheogens would be the mushrooms that include psilocybin, the ayahuasca, which is derived from a vine that comes from Brazil, and peyote, which I think most people are familiar with what those things are. But there are a number of things that have been used in numerous religions. To some degree, when you think about it, it is much older than even the idea of Christianity that this entheogenic process exists.
Yes. Yeah. So it's, and I have a story, a Christianity story, which is a kind of a good one for the new viewers. So my mother was my mother is Irish Catholic, extremely plagued by stigma. I started using cannabis as medicine, and she was not happy about it. And so literally, I love you, Mom. She blocked me on Facebook, wrote me out of her will, sending me letters for a while. And I really had to put it on the back burner. 2018, I'm using cannabis. I'm coming off my pharmaceuticals. I started this podcast. And what I started doing was interviewing people that have compelling stories of healing that was using cannabis as medicine. And sometimes what would happen is when people would hear I would do a podcast, they volunteer. So a patient that I've been taking care of since 2017 volunteered to come on, and she was a nun. And she basically could not believe she had RSD, or chronic regional pain syndrome, which is a very, very debilitating chronic disease with intractable pain. She was on over 400 micrograms of fentanyl. She had to get lidocaine infusions. She had an internal neurotransmitter stimulator, and basically sick, suffering. She was only up for 4 hours a day. She wasn't able to do what she loved, which was to serve people, spiritually in the Catholic Church. So what ended up happening was she came to me and we started working. She came to the Green Nurse, and we started working with her, started using oils, and all of a sudden, slowly but surely, she was able to start to wean off. Halfway through her weaning process, she was blown away. She was able to start her activities of daily living. She's off of the fentanyl now, and she's back to the church. But in the midst, she decided to do a podcast with me and to share her story. And literally, this was for my mother. And and with all due respect, I said, Sister Suzanne, with all due respect, there are a lot of people that are out there that are, very religious, and they have a stigma around this, and they think that it's a sin. So this question is for my mother. Sister Suzanne, what would Jesus say about all this cannabis? And she looked at me and she goes, Sherri, Jesus would say, what the frig did it take you so long to use this God-given plant that I created for you? He would expect us to use it, and it's a sin if you don't.
Of course. Of course.
I took that clip and I sent it to my mother, and guess what? It had an impact on her. So I always tell people, share those stories. Those stories need to be told, because what ended up happening was my mother sat with that, watched the podcast, called me up and said, okay, what's the gateway? I'm scared, but I want to try this. If Sister Suzanne can do it, so can I. And so then we started to go down that journey, and my mom is now using cannabis as medicine, and she came on the podcast. Yeah. Right. So it was just, so it's just basically, it's really about perception consciousness. And when we're talking about plant entheogens, and cannabis, being one of them, what does it do? It opens up consciousness. And when you think about it in a physiological way, right, it improves neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is our brain's ability to communicate. Right side, left brain. Right side, left side communication, things start to rewire. Opens up, it stimulates neurotransmitters. Cannabis is a pleiotropic working on multiple different physiological systems all at the same time. THC is in, total healthcare, right? THC, and it's bio, psycho, social, spiritual healing. Healing isn't the absence of illness or disease. It's doing the best you can with what you have right here, right now. And cannabis is probably one of the most powerful tools, completely, hands down. So that was my little story there. But I want to get back into what is happening in cannabis church cases these days. And I want to get into that a little bit more because you know what, I would really love to see more churches pop up. It might be, I think it would be a good thing. People are really turning towards spirituality these days and really starting to take an interest in consciousness and expanding their minds and perception shifts, because we are in times of trauma. We're in traumatic times right now, and people are being traumatized by a lot of different things. And this plant can really help gain perspective. If you think about it, right, you can't solve a problem or work through an emotional crises, mental, challenges in the same state of mind that created it. You have to step out of it. And so what happens with this plant, right, is it pulls you out of the trajectory and the story. So you can start to look at things from different perspectives and literally get a grip and process the emotion around what's going on immediately. And it takes time, but I'm going to tell you, it does work. So let's get back to you, because I love, I really want to know about what's happening in the cannabis church cases and what are the results and how are churches, taking care of their people.
Well, throughout history, religions have been subject to adversity. They've been subject to attacks. And I think the story that you told about your mom and her ability to have her heart softened and to open up to the idea of cannabis is fantastic. And I've seen that so many times. I've seen folks who came from a dispensary side of things, a commercial money-based side of things related to cannabis, and have their hearts change and literally be laughing about religious aspects of cannabis as a sacrament and have their hearts soften and change. And I think there is, with every civil rights battle, with every battle where you're fighting for people's minds, this adversity that goes on that you have to get through, and there's persecution as well. And so the churches suffer from this persecution, and the persecution comes in the form of those folks who are closed-minded at the beginning, that laugh at the beginning. I, a few years ago, went to court. Several churches had opened. I'd been brought in by the Native American group to look at being a warrior, the attorney for these churches. At first, I was skeptical, and I went out into the desert, was blessed as a medicine person, and learned and began to understand, had my heart softened, as well as my daughter Victoria's, who had always had a very religious perspective on cannabis and its use. It took me a little bit longer, despite because I've been secular. I've been a lawyer focused on the laws, on the ADA stuff, on those, not the spiritual side. So the churches had opened, and several had hired me to come in and represent them. And at the beginning, this is probably about 5 years ago, I'd go to court, and the courts they'd shut down the church. despite the fact that the members were sincere and believed in cannabis as sacrament. There were others who'd gone out and taken and made churches that were simply dispensaries selling cannabis for profit. And some of those had come to me, and I'd represented some of them at the beginning, not recognizing that that was the intent that they had, that it had a negative impact on things. But even some of those people who'd started that way, their hearts were softened. I think the higher power had and the prayers and the spiritual things that had gone on had softened their hearts, and they'd become understanding that this isn't the religion isn't a joke. It's not fake. It's not something that's a joke. So there was a point in about 2018 where I was very discouraged. There are several decisions handed down where the two churches had been shut down by the government, by the state of California government, the localities. And so I decided I needed to write I needed to be more focused and do a better brief and do some better arguments. I prayed and I sat down and I did that. I prepared a much more effective argument that we took forward, and we started winning on issues and winning on cases and matters, and preventing cities from getting orders to lock down and close the churches. We still have losses. Nothing's 100% where but gradually adversity began. Well, the things started moving our direction, and I was in court about 2 weeks ago, and it was in Riverside County, and I'd been there before, where a judge had just been very, very discriminatory towards the churches, and another judge back around the 2018 period had refused to give the city of Harupa Valley an order to shut down a church. I was back before the court, and the city was coming in attacking again, and we were able to put some witnesses forward and show the judge that in fact this was a church. We need to be able to do that. We need to be able to express the sincerity of the church. That's really all the courts are interested in, is the sincerity of the churches.
Right.
And I guess there's a New York Times article that came out a couple of years ago about the Jaw Church that was in Big Bear, and currently the church is closed. It's closed because the county of San Bernardino just relentlessly attacked the ministers of that church. And the court did not order closure of the church. We went through a trial, a multi-month trial, where the court in that case found that the church was a bona fide church. It's a bona fide church that has cannabis as sacrament. And the judge in that case said, he found that the blessing of cannabis into holy sacrament, the effect is the same as the Catholic Church blessing wine into the blood of Jesus Christ in the process of transubstantiation. He found that he had to find that in fact that was what happens with the blessing of the cannabis sacrament. There's this issue. The court, it's a very good judge. It's a judge named David Cohn. He's a very good judge. I've tried to be very fair in the case. But the issue came up is when cannabis is provisioned to the members at the church, and it's not cannabis at that point, it's sacrament. There's no money paid for it. There's no quid pro quo. The members don't have to pay money for it, but the members tithe. And the state of California wants to call this separate and independent tithing that's done by individuals a commercial cannabis transaction and a basis for closing down the churches. Well, people get the wine sacrament at the Catholic Church, and maybe it's just a sip, or it's more, they can't throw away any of that wine that's been blessed in the blood of Jesus Christ. But the fact is, they get that there, and then you tithe into a bowl, and so really again, it comes down to this money thing. That's what's going on. The state of California is so concerned about tax money and taxing things, and is somewhat anti-religious. in how it operates. And so the issue is on appeal. The issue of whether people should be able to tithe and whether the Internal Revenue Code quid pro quo donation is applicable to churches are on appeal before the 4th District Court of Appeal in California. And then it will probably go to the California Supreme Court. And after that, up the federal line, hopefully to the United States Supreme Court, where you have a number of justices who are very pro religious freedom. And it's very important that government not be in the business of saying, well, because you believe it's cannabis and we think we should be getting 40 to 45% of everything that comes in from cannabis, and people are tithing there. And so it's really quite sick and inappropriate behavior by the government. They're interfering with the religious practices and beliefs of a number of people. One thing that Judge Cohn found, he said, you have a lot of people in the church that believe strongly in the beliefs of the church. And then you have some that don't believe as strongly. And then you have some that may not believe much at all. And I liken that to, you have people that go to the Catholic Church every Sunday, every day, light candles every day. You have people that just go on Sundays. You have people that just go on Christmas and those types of events. But all of them have the right to their religious beliefs and practices. And the Catholic Church doesn't have to have a license, and it doesn't get raided, and it doesn't have the police coming in and investigating it. And if people take a moment to read that New York Times article about the Jaw Church and about the fight there, it's clear. These members of the church, all of us, have strong belief in cannabis as sacrament, both as a healing and spiritual entheogen. And so where the fight is right now is that appeal is pending. And then there's a Shinto church that I represent in Gardena, California, which is in Los Angeles County. And that church is open right now. But it had gone through the entire conditional use permitting process required by that city. And it had been approved by the city's internal planning commission, knowing that cannabis was its sacrament. All of that put forward. They'd asked questions right at the beginning, knew that it had cannabis as sacrament as part of its ancient rituals and as part of it subscribing to the 9 Epiphany scriptures and scriptures of the various cannabis religions. But knowing that, it had gone then to its planning commission for a public meeting in May last year, and that planning commission approved the permit for it. And the city council came in a month later and overturned that planning commission, arguing on the record in a YouTube COVID meeting of the city council, making all sorts of discriminatory anti-religious statements in what they were talking about, things that clearly were based on the beliefs of the church in cannabis as sacrament as reasons for overturning that approval. And then as soon as they get wind that the church is going to fight against the city of Gardena, the city blacks out public meeting on YouTube. It blacks it out so nobody can get to it anymore.
Oh, wow.
Just terrible behavior. But we're in a fight with that city as well in Los Angeles Superior Court. And with those two cases, as well as a case involving a church in Santa Clara, California, I'm working as hard as I can, with very limited resources, to ensure that the religious rights of these members are honored under our system of religious freedom in this country. And that was long-winded. So,
no,
but I'm very passionate about this argument. This argument is important because this is your right to have cannabis. Just saying that you can go out and you can use cannabis spiritually. Well, what about if you want to do that in a church environment, in an environment where you are with fellow practitioners or parishioners? Practitioners. Guess I'd be a practitioner, you'd be a practitioner, and the church folks are parishioners. But and you want to participate in ceremonies and healing ceremonies and those types of things. That should not be restricted. And the ability for a church to provide the blessed sacrament to its members should not be restricted by government. It's wrong. And it's all based on the government of California's. It's absolutely based on its desire to get money. That's all it's based on, Sherri. It's not based on, there's nothing else about it. It's all about the money with the state of California.
Yep.
And
well,
it's sad.
Matthew, it's extremely sad. And this is going to probably lead into another heated moment. But I just want to say thank you for everything that you're doing. And, you know, just for the viewers, they need to know how tough it is. What battle scars do you have from the long-term war you fought against the government? People need to know what you've done. I mean, seriously, this is
you know, this
activism.
It started out, you know, back when people were getting arrested for cannabis. I'll talk about Marla for a minute. Marla and David James, and Marla died a few months ago. It was very tragic and terrible for me because I was very close to her. She's in a wheelchair. She and David are on welfare. They didn't make a lot of money. They're activists, wonderful people, lived in Huntington Beach, California. And we had been fighting for the right of patients to access cannabis with the case called Marla James versus the cities of Costa Mesa and Lake Forest. It's a federal case. It's reported. It's a relatively famous case. I lost it. I lost the case, you know, in a 2-1 decision by the Ninth Circuit. That was about the money. But after that, the federal government came in at the behest of a law firm called Best and Krieger, a big law firm that represents California cities, came in and asked then U.S. Attorney Andre Barrott to come in LA and help close down these terrible dispensaries. These terrible dispensaries, now they're licensed and they're fine. And they're generating tax, but they're terrible dispensaries then that are harming people and doing all this harm. As you know, cannabis is not it doesn't kill anybody, okay? It doesn't hurt any, it's a plant. It's not a danger, okay? But it's so horrible. So it has called on the federal government to help with this. Federal government comes in. What it does is it starts filing these forfeiture cases to get the properties of landowners, of people that own buildings, that are leasing those buildings to licensed, state, not licensed, but state compliant medical cannabis dispensaries at the time. You couldn't have licenses at that time. It was just that they were compliant with state law. And feds came in and started doing this. And there was a landowner in Anaheim, California, named Tony Jalali, come over with his wife, had a building, and a wonderful patient named Chuck Ikai, very dedicated to medical cannabis, who ran a collective, nonprofit collective at the time in Anaheim, and leased the space from Tony Jalali. And one day, the federal government came in and said, "We're going to get you. They file a lawsuit against Tony and his wife and say, we're going to take your building." At the time, we just come out of the recession, so the building was low value, probably worth $3 or $4 million now, but we're going to take your $1.5 million building from you, which there was no mortgage on. They'd worked all of their lives to pay off this building for retirement. We're going to take that from you because you're leasing it to this cannabis dispensary. And I said, Tony, I don't think you should give in. They'd done this to another in Lake Forest, California. The federal government had come in, tried to do the same thing. Said, I don't think you should give in. Took me probably 8-9 meetings at the Sizzler restaurant in Lake Forest to get Tony to say, yeah, I want to fight against this. And so that fight began about 2012 against the city of Anaheim. We discovered that the city of Anaheim and the federal government has this thing called equitable sharing, where if you're breaking a federal law and it comes in, and the city of Anaheim, and eventually I had more landlords, so Los Angeles, Anaheim, Santa Ana, several other cities, that if that property was forfeited by the federal government, that the cities would get 80% of whatever money the federal government got from doing this. Now, the one building in Lake Forest that didn't want to hire me, they apparently had the best cannabis lawyer in the world. And they did have a real good one that I really like, a guy named Chris Glue in Orange County, California. I think it's a fantastic lawyer. But they had Chris. But Chris wasn't going to move forward on that. They hadn't even approached him to do it. They paid a huge close to $1 million fine instead of fighting against it. So Tony and these other landlords decided that they would fight against the federal government. And in the discovery process, we found that the federal government engaged in a series of conspiratorial actions with the cities to improperly shut down these state compliant entities. I remember going before Judge Andrew Guilford, a federal judge, after filing a lawsuit against the United States, a counterclaim. And a couple of things that happened is he admonished the United States. And after that, I was working with Marla and David to work towards winning against the federal government. We had several strategies we'd put in place. And so one day, Marla and David, in their 1996, I think it was, Ford Windstar van with 300,000 miles on it, with the wheelchair ramp on it for Marla to get in. David, about 60 years old, Marla probably about 54, 55 at the time, are driving into their apartment that is paid for with welfare in Huntington Beach. It was a very small one-bedroom apartment. I remember going to it multiple times over the years, and they are pulled over by 3 or 4 SUVs with the lights on them, and exiting from the SUVs, they pull them over, are DEA agents to attack these two people who are advocating for cannabis, who use cannabis to treat their disabilities, who had sued in the James case before, and who are fighting against and supporting Tony Jalali and the other landlords in these forfeiture cases. And they came and they attacked Marla and David, warned them, had guns drawn on them. Marla was on the phone with me at the time.
Oh no!
Several weeks after this, we go to court in federal court in Santa Ana, and before Judge Guilford. We have an argument. Judge Guilford rules that the counterclaim that we'd filed, and I had several amicus curiae group that had come in to help us, a group in Washington, D.C., the Institute for Justice, had come in to help us. Well, a couple of lawyers had flown out for this hearing. And so as I go into court, I usually shake the hands of the opposition if I can, or try to say hi. So I'd walked over to shake the hand of this United States attorney, the senior United States attorney in charge of asset forfeiture in the Central District of California, named Steve Welk, and his subordinate, a guy named John Gallatin. And so I walk over to shake Steve's. Everybody's in the courtroom except the judge. The clerks, the gallery has people in it. Marla and David are watching the hearing. And so I walk over, and Steve says, "I'm not shaking your hand, Pappas." And he refuses to shake my hand. But the other lawyers that are with me, he goes ahead and shakes theirs. And John Gallatin, who was really a nice guy, this other U.S. attorney, reached out, "I'll shake your hand, Matt." And he shakes my hand. We go ahead and have the hearing. As the hearing gets done, the judges ruled in our favor. He's going to allow this 10th Amendment counterclaim to go ahead against the United States. We're walking out of the courtroom. Marla is sitting there, and she grabs Steve Welk and says, "I just wanted to let you know, Mr. Welk, I'm Marla James. And I wanted to thank you," she's being sarcastic, "for sending those DEA agents after David and I the other day, a few weeks ago, because it had caused David and Marla a great deal of angst, having them being pulled over at gunpoint." So as Gallatin and Welk are walking out, now I want everybody to talk about settlement, which they always do, the judges do. I get up from my chair and I'm having to squirm out. I really don't want Welk talking to Marla. She's sitting, her wheelchair is kind of positioned outside of the bench. So I come out, and they're getting to the vestibule, the 2 doors going out to the hallway as I'm getting there. And I get into that hallway. I say, "Well, the judge wanted us to talk." And Welk tells me to F off in that little vestibule. And we get out into the hallway, and there's a couple of reporters there. And I don't fight people. I don't fight people physically. That's not what I do. But I do have a little bit of a temper. And at this point, I get out in the hallway. I've never had a physical fight before. I fight with my words, or I run and hide behind the wall. Okay, I just, that's not my way of dealing with things. And so, but I was probably about 6 inches away from this guy. And he says, "You know why I refuse to shake your hand, Pappas? Because it's from 2000 BC, and it's telling the other side that you're unarmed so that you can discuss things. and I'm not going to do that. And we were pulled apart by two of the other people, and this got reported, of course. And so that's one of the battle scars, having this United States attorney about to hit me in the hallway. That's one. After the Long Beach cases, we'd beaten the city of Long Beach, all this corrupt activity going on in Long Beach. We'd won in a major case. It was embarrassing for the city. The city refused to give me a business license for my law office in a space in the city, and they sent their police officers and code enforcement officers to cite me multiple times. I had to contact for operating a business without a business license when we had gone down and paid all the fees, gotten approved by all the inspections. But the guy that was in charge of the cannabis permitting that was fraudulent and being done improperly, as I had alleged, and the appellate court had stricken down that Long Beach provision, the guy in charge, he was also the final say on business licenses. So he refused to grant the business license. So they're citing me for not having a business. I didn't even have the front door unlocked, and they're citing me because they knew I'd rented the office and built it out. Anyway, they cited me. I had to call up to the Attorney General, who was Kamala Harris at the time, and she referred me to her then subordinate, who called, and the charges were eventually dismissed in the interest of justice. Later, I've been attacked by the cities, by the government, multiple times. I could just go on. I was followed around by the FBI. And none of this is conspiratorial. Before all of this, I would think somebody telling me these stories that it was a bunch of conspiracy theory stuff.
Right.
But it's not. It's true.
I know.
It's gone on for years and years and years. So, anyway, yeah.
Well, Matthew, this has been a really amazing podcast. I just, I want to say thank you for all that you do for the people. I mean, seriously, civil rights to me is, we see so many patients that are, being discriminated against, and it's really disheartening. People that want to pay for their medicine, that can't afford their medicine. It's just endless. And so we tapped upon a lot of it. And I just want to say thank you for representing the people. Seriously, it's really, I'm very, very grateful, really grateful that someone is really actually doing this, because it is so important. And we need to stop, the nonsense, the devil's lettuce, the cannabis conspiracy theories, they go on and on and on. And
cannabis is an amazing plant that was put here by the higher power. And it really is something that we need to fight for. We need to fight for people to have the ability, because it goes beyond cannabis. That's a small microcosm of the issue here. Right. And you see it growing in many subject areas today. So I wish I could be stronger and fight harder. There have been periods of times where I've not been able to keep up my strength, but we do as we can. So
do the best we can. So how can our viewers find you? Do you have a website that you
No, I don't have a website. And
no website. Okay, so people
no website, there's no advertising, there's no social media. They can reach out to you to reach out to me. Okay. I'm really and you're welcome to give out my email. I don't have any social media. I'm off of Facebook and those things and Twitter, but I do think this is very important, and I would encourage people to be strong and to stand up for what you believe in. Don't let government push you around where they shouldn't be in this supposedly free country that we can keep free if we as citizens stand up and raise our voices.
Yep, absolutely. So Matthew, don't sign out yet. I'm just going to wrap this up. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We went a little overtime, but I think it was truly worth it. Spirituality is the root of cannabis care, plant entheogens, cannabis churches. Matthew Pappas, civil rights attorney, has just, this was a really, really great show. So thank you for joining us. I just want to let you know about next week. Next week, we have 2 podcasts. One at noontime, high noon, with Elizabeth Mack and I. It's going to be our monthly webinar podcast, and we're going to be talking about gastrointestinal illnesses and autoimmune conditions. So that's going to be a really good one. And then next Wednesday evening, at 8 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to have another attorney on. Her name is, I'm drawing a blank, Maureen West. Maureen West. So she's a cannabis attorney that's actually working with nurses and health professionals and giving them a little bit of guidance and coaching as they enter into the space doing consulting or starting their new business and becoming an entrepreneur. So make sure you join us for that. The other thing that we have going on too is a special all month. Elizabeth Mack, I want to say thank you so much to her. She wrote this amazing book called Cannabis for Health, Become a Coach. And she actually has created a lot of educational programs. And so one of the programs that's on sale is autoimmune and cannabis. And so 25% off with Immune 25. So visit us at www.holisticcaring.com and check out those programs. And everyone, like I said, thank you for joining us. And remember what it's all about. It is about living your best life and helping others do the same. This is our ending video. Here we go.
We're here to educate and empower patients to make choices that are best for them. We're also here to decrease stigma around what it means to feel good and be high. Hence the H for hope, I for inspiration, G for growth, and H for healing. The Green Nurse is a holistic cannabis nurse that teaches on the endocannabinoid system and the safe utilization of cannabis and other progressive tools to help people reach a better quality of life.
I was cannabis agnostic for many, many years. And you know, the more research I did, the more I discovered that cannabis is this amazing medicine.
I was told that I had a 4-stage pancreatic cancer. The doctor really told me he couldn't do anything else. He gave me her name and she called me and she came to my house. She started to give me cannabis. My oncologist was puzzled because he couldn't find the cancer anymore.
All of the learning that we get comes from the Green Nurses Group, comes from their support, comes from their guidance. I trust everything that she says.
Simply meet people where they're at. The plant doesn't, stress to grow, so we don't stress to share it. We're healing people.
Cannabis has been used as a medicine for tens upon thousands of years. Here's the big message. Cannabis needs to be federally legal. We need to have laws that are the same across all 50 states that allow access to anyone and everyone who wants to utilize this powerful medicine.